Leeward side, by the way, just want to correct. I live out on the west side in Waianae. West side's the best side. So, how's it going? I've always wanted to be a fantastic uncle. As the youngest of three brothers, with one brother who's 4 and another brother who's 8 years older than me, I always kind of figured I wasn't going to have kids first, or so I hoped. And when my first niece was born, I made sure to take every opportunity I could to do what I thought a fantastic uncle would do. Now, one such opportunity, I was on the back lanai at my parents' house, and I was sitting with one of my brothers, and my niece, Haley, who was 5 years old at this time, that's her, she came up to me, and she tapped me. She said, "Uncle Jojo," I'm Uncle Jojo. She said, "Uncle Jojo, would you please get me some juice?" And I thought to myself, like, of course I can get you some juice. I want to be a fantastic uncle. I'll get you all the juice in the world. I'll make it just rain juice upon you. Of course I'll get you some juice. So I stood up. And as I stood up, I felt a tap on my shoulder. And I looked, and it was my brother. And he said, "Hey, where are you going?" And I thought, well, I'm going to go be a fantastic uncle. I'm about to get my niece some juice. And he said, "Well, do you think she could do that for herself?" And I hadn't thought of that, so I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, "Well, really, what does it take to get juice?" And I said, well, I'd have to go inside, and I'd have to open the refrigerator, and I'd have to, pick up a packet of juice, and, unscrew the cap, and, give it to Haley. And he's like, "Okay. Now, do you think she's capable of doing that herself?" And I said, I want to believe in my niece. I want to be a fantastic uncle, so of course she could do that by herself. And he looked at me and he said, "Well, then why would you take that experience away from her? And why would you make her depend on you to get juice?" And I had not thought of it like that. And as an educator, I've found that sometimes in my drive to do what I think a fantastic educator would do and do as much as I can, sometimes I've taken away meaningful experiences from my students. Because sometimes what we do for others is a tacit statement of what we believe they can't do for themselves. Now, I was lucky enough to grow up in the greatest place on the planet, on Oahu. And I was also fortunate in that I got to go to Punahou School. I always saw myself as very blessed. I got to live in the greatest place I could imagine, and I had access to an excellent education. And all through high school, I was very cognizant of how blessed I was. I knew I always needed to give back. I remember days where I'd get to school, and I'd go to symphony practice, and then I'd leave school. Please don't tell my mom. And I'd leave school, and I'd go on a hike to Kapena Falls, and I'd jump off a cliff into water, dry myself off, and then come back for an AP calculus class. I knew I was very blessed. I knew I'd been given a lot. And the words of the president of my school always rung in my head. And what he said at the beginning of every year was, "To whom much is given, much is expected." And I knew much was given to me. So in turn, I knew much was expected of me. And I remember in high school committing myself to coming back to Oahu as an educator, because I knew all the students here had access to the most beautiful place in the world. But not all of them had equal access to an excellent education. Now, I got that opportunity when I was accepted into Teach for America and placed out in Waianae. Now, all I knew of Waianae then was what I knew from growing up, which was you're kind of a smart-mouthed, short haole kid. Maybe don't go there. And the only 2 times I even remember going through Waianae was on sometimes an air-conditioned bus just to get to Kaena Point with a father-son camping crew. And even then, I remember being told, "Be careful what you leave on the bus." And so when I was placed there, I was placed at a school called Kamaile Academy. And I did my research on it. And I found out it was historically one of the lowest performing schools in the state in terms of standardized testing. And it had some of the highest incidences of poverty and homelessness, something I could barely wrap my head around. Now, regardless of that, I thought, when I first started, the problem here is that no one's just giving these kids answers. I had the same mindset I had when I was going to get my niece some juice. I thought, no one's getting these answers for him. No one's giving it to him. I'm going to come in here on my white horse like a shining white knight, and I'm going to give them all the answers, and then they're going to be great. And so I started off in that mindset. I started off like many teachers do, teaching in the way I was taught. And I was taught through direct instruction. Someone stands at the board and writes for an hour and talks to you about what the right answers are, and you just write it down, and then you write it down, and then you write it down, and then you take it home, and then you practice it. So that's what I started to do. Now, I was very lucky my first year because I got to have 90-minute class periods every day. And the reason this was lucky is because it forced me to do something a little different. Because I thought then that all the information had to come from me. I was the source of information for my students. I had to be. But I knew I couldn't speak for 90 minutes straight. And so I set up my class to have the first 15 minutes of class be students coming in to grab a textbook to start going over math problems on their own, to start learning the lesson from that day. And I also showed them problems that they were supposed to answer by the end of class, after I'd supposedly given them their juice or their knowledge. And I also did this because I wanted the students to enter the class in a calm and orderly way. That was the main reason I thought that was going to be beneficial. Now, that part worked, but I got so much more that I didn't count on. Now, about 2 weeks after I started doing this, I remember students had come to class, they were entering orderly, it was great, and they all picked up their textbooks and were starting to just read the lesson. And after about 12 minutes, a student raised her hand. And I thought, what are you doing? And I called her and I said, Christina, what's up? And she looked at me and she said, hey, can you come check my answers? And I thought to myself, what do you mean check your answers? I haven't taught you this. I haven't given you the juice, so to speak. It's only been 12 minutes. So I said, okay, and I walked over, and not only did she have all of the right answers, but she'd shown all her work too. So she looked up at me and said, all right, well, what do I do now? And I was as confused as she was. I said, well, sadly, you're about to sit through 75 minutes of me teaching you what you figured out in 12. My apologies. And luckily, she was very nice about it. Now, a little later, a few weeks after that, another student, after the students entered class, the first 15 minutes was them reading over a textbook, couldn't believe it was working, and after the 15 minutes was up, I said, all right, time to put your textbooks away. I'm about to do my lesson, give you the juice in this sense. And one student raised his hands. And I looked at him, I said, hey, what's up? And he said, can we have 5 more minutes, please? I'm really getting into this. I think I've almost got it. I remember thinking to myself, I thought 2 things. First, you want 5 more minutes to read a math textbook. And then I also sadly thought, well, how boring am I? But I said, of course. I didn't say any of that. I just, of course. And they all stayed engaged, and they all kept trying to teach themselves. And that's what I did for my first year. I stuck with that form of education. And my second year, classes were shortened to 55 minutes a day, much more reasonable. And I thought, I've already taught for one whole entire year. I'm sure I can get kids to come in calm and orderly, so I cut that part of class out. I didn't realize the benefits until later. So I did my song and dance, I did direct instruction, and it worked. The students took notes. I put everything I could into my PowerPoints. I tried to make it engaging and scaffold it in a way that would help all students learn. And they were doing well enough. But 2 things happened about halfway through that year that sort of shook my understanding of how I need to educate my students. Now, the first thing was finding out what was happening to my old students. Because the students I had the previous year worked hard, and finally, by the end of it, most all of them were doing quite well. And I found out that many of them who now had a new teacher, many of them who were getting A's and B's were sadly now getting D's and F's. Many of them now hated math, something I don't allow said. And some of them were even running out of their math class, literally. And it worried me because I didn't want their success to be contingent upon me. I didn't think there was anything good about getting 1 good year in for these kids if going forward that success wasn't replicated. And sadly, they had a teacher that year who didn't put the same time in and didn't structure his lessons in the same way. So that scared me. And the second thing I saw that worried me was on a day I was feeling ill. I was feeling sick, so I thought, well, I can't go into school tomorrow. I don't want to get anybody sick. So I typed up a sub-plan for the substitute the next day, and I gave it to a fellow teacher, an excellent teacher who was one of my mentors. And I gave it to him, and I said, can you please give this to the sub? And he said, of course. And when he looked it over, he sort of giggled, and he said, well, what are you doing? And I said, well, what do you mean? You know, I wrote it. What do you mean? And he said, well, you're asking the students to learn new things. And I said, of course, there's not that much time. We have to cover a lot of material. And he said, the students can't learn new things if their teacher isn't here. He said, the best you can expect is that the sub gets them to practice things that you've already taught them. And I couldn't accept that either. I'd realized that I'd made these students, while successful, dependent on me to get their juice, so to speak, or to get their knowledge. And I wasn't okay with that because I knew I wasn't going to be around or the educator for these students every year of their life. So I knew I needed to do something drastically different. So I did. And I thought back to my first year teaching, and I thought, well, that 15 minutes, that seemed to go well. Let's try that out just for a whole class period. And I did. And I gave the students the information up front. I thought about what I use. So I said, here's access to the internet. Here's the textbook. Here are the problems you need to know how to do. I will be here as a support, but you are going to teach yourselves. Effectively, you're going to let yourselves get your own juice. I'm going to be here to help you if you need. And we started that, and engagement went up, and students bought in a little more. And one student, how I remember, in particular, a few weeks into this, stopped me on a Friday, and I'm pretty sure he waited till all the other students were gone, because he wanted to ask me something, and his name was Noah. And a quick backstory on Noah. He's a wonderful kid, but he always got around a C- D+ on just about everything. He did what he needed to get by, but didn't really buy into math. And I knew he was a really bright kid, and I just wanted to get to him, and I couldn't figure it out. So he stops me after class, and he says, Mr. D, could I have some extra worksheets to go over on the weekend? And could I also borrow a textbook, because I want to make sure I'm doing it right? I thought to myself, you can have all the worksheets in the world. You can have 5 textbooks. Don't tell the principal. But you can have, take it home. Of course you can. You can have all of it. And what made it more exciting for me was that he sought me out the following Monday, to tell me and show me how much he'd done. And he said, Mr. D, look at all this stuff. And he was proud of what he taught himself, about what he did for himself. And I had nothing to do with it, other than just being proud. Now, not every student had the same story as Noah that year, so I tried to reflect on it and think about, what do I need to do to set up a classroom environment to be effective for everyone? And what I realized is that all students need intellectual safety, and I wanted to create that for them. So to start class the following year, I had the students do a reflection, and I had them answer 3 questions. I said, 1, who are you as a student? Who are you as a class member? 2, what can I, Mr. D, what can I do to support you in your success? And 3, what can your class do to support you in your success? And I had them reflect on it and share out to the whole group so everyone knew where everyone stood. And what blew me away was the degree of honesty I got from every student. I had students standing up in front of my classroom, in front of me, saying, yeah, I like to joke around a lot, and I'm not that into math, so I try to get myself a little bit distracted. I remember thinking, I'm right here. Like, teachers right here ask you to do this. And other students would say, I like to joke around. I like to make jokes, and sometimes I'll distract my classmates. And the thing that excited me about these things is not that they said those, but that every single student that said something like that followed it up, dead honest, with, so please, if I'm getting off task, or if I'm bothering you, tell me to shut up. I remember saying, whoa, we don't say shut up in this classroom. But that's fantastic. They wanted their classmates to get them back online, because every student wants to be successful. Now, after that started, there were 2 students that started doing exceedingly well. And these are students that were previously failing my class. They would get around 20 or 30% on their tests. And after we started doing this, after that happened, over a 2-week period, they had the highest scores on every class assignment I gave out. of the entire of all the algebra sections I taught. And I looked online to see the time they were spending, and they spent over 12 and a half hours in 2 weeks on their own doing math work. They were bragging to each other on Facebook about how much time they'd spent. And so I remember thinking at the time, how is this happening? I need to see this and I need to believe it. And so I called one of the students in after school. And I said, let's work on some math problems, because part of me was a little bit scared that he might be cheating. And I felt bad. I honestly did feel bad that I thought that. But I thought, how could you be so different? How could you have made this change? So I called him in after school, and I said, let's go over some problems. And he came in, and he started working on some problems, and he answered the first one correct, and the second one correct, and they kept on being correct. So finally, I just said, all right, stop. How are you doing this? And he looked at me, and he's used to getting questions from me, so he said, well, Mr. D, first you need to find the y-intercept, so you go on the y-axis, and I said, yeah, I know that you get that part. I said, not that. I said, how are you doing this? You're a different person today than you even said you were. And he looked at me rather seriously, which he rarely did. And he said, Mr. D, I said I was a jokester. He said, but I didn't want to just be the jokester anymore. He said, I didn't want to be the dumb kid anymore. He said, I wanted to prove that I could be somebody else. And when I started teaching, I thought all information came from me. And I have learned as much, if not more, in these past 4 years teaching from my students as they have from me. And one thing they taught me that's very important that will always stick with me is they taught me really what it means to be fantastic. Because being fantastic, whether it's as an educator or as an uncle, isn't necessarily about how much you can do for someone else or how much you can give to someone else. Oftentimes, being fantastic is about creating meaningful experiences and a supportive environment that believes in someone enough that they get to prove how much they can do for themselves. Thank you very much.